Alright guys, so before we get started, I just want to explain that this section is basically the JavaScript language from scratch. So if you're not new to JavaScript, you're going to know a lot of these concepts, but I'd still suggest watching them, maybe even with double speed on. Even if you know this stuff, a refresher isn't going to hurt. We're going to talk about data types, conversion, functions, loops, arrays, object literals, all the core fundamentals of the language. Okay, we're going to work in the console for the most part, and then in the next section we'll start on the document object model and working in the UI with events and so on. So what I want to do first is just set up our sandbox, which is very simple. It's just going to be an HTML file and a JavaScript file, and I'll go over how to include internal script tags as well as how to link an external JavaScript file with script tags. Alright, so let's go ahead and jump in and get started. Alright, so I'm on my desktop. We already have Visual Studio Code installed, and that's the text editor that I'll be using. So what I'm going to do is create a new folder here, and I'm going to call it JS_sandbox. Okay, and this is what we're going to work in for quite a while. So I'm going to open it with Visual Studio Code by right-clicking and saying Open with Code. But if you're not using this text editor, just open up this folder in whatever you're using. Alright, I'm going to just close the welcome screen up, and you can see we have an empty JS sandbox folder over here. So I'm just going to create two files. One is index.html, and then I'm also going to create one called app.js. Okay, so that's what I'm going to choose to call my main JavaScript file. Alright, now in the index.html we're going to create a basic structure. Visual Studio Code includes Emmet by default, which allows me to use shortcuts, and I can just do an exclamation tab, and that'll give me this basic HTML structure with head and body tags. Alright, so I'm just going to change the title here to JavaScript Sandbox, and I'm going to say this is section 2, and then I'm going to put an H1 down here and put the same thing. So we'll just say JavaScript Sandbox section 2. Alright, now I'm going to save this, and I'm using Live Server as you saw me set up back in the environment setup video. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and say Open with Live Server. That's going to go ahead and open this up in a browser. You can see the H1. I can open up my console in the browser with F12, and we're going to go over the console in the next video. But what I want to do now is just show you how to insert JavaScript into your HTML file. Alright, so you can do two things. You can do it inside the HTML file, or you can link to an external file like our app.js. So if I were to just put in script tags here, I could actually run JavaScript. So I could say like alert, which is a window function that will just show a pop-up with whatever I put in here. So if I say hello and I save that, you'll see that it'll automatically run. Now, it automatically runs when I save because I'm using Live Server. If you're not using something like that, you'll have to reload the page in order for it to run. Okay, now this putting a script tag in your HTML I wouldn't recommend unless it's maybe one or two lines of JavaScript that you're using. So we're not going to do that for this course. We're going to go ahead and link to our app.js by just putting in script tags and then setting source src equal to app.js. Alright, now if we had the JavaScript file in another folder, like a JS folder, we'd have to say JS/app.js. Alright, but since it's in the same directory or the same folder, we don't have to do that. So let's save it. Let's go to app.js and let's try out an alert. So we'll say alert, we'll say hello world and save, and it runs, and now we know that app.js is linked. Alright, so now we have our little sandbox to work in. In the next video, we're going to explore the Google Chrome console. Alright guys, so in the last video we created our initial index.html and app.js file, and we have those linked, and I have this running in Live Server from VS Code. You can see it's on my local host here. And of course you don't need to do that. You can just open it right on your file system, or you can use some other type of server. Whatever you want to do is fine. Now, one thing I didn't mention is how to stop the server. So if you want to stop it, then you can go down to this right here where it says port 5500, click that, and that will actually close the server up. So now if I were to reload this page, it's not going to work. All right, and then if you want to run it again, you can just right click and say open with live server. Okay, so in this video, what I want to do is just focus on the console, because that's what we're going to be working in for a while. The console gives us a way to test things, to debug, to just a way to get to output stuff from our code. All right, back in the day before DevTools, we would do things like alert. If we wanted to, show something really quick, we would just say alert and run that, which isn't very efficient and it's just not a good way to do things. So now we have the console, and in Chrome and just about any other browser, you can open it up, the DevTools up with F12, and then you have different tabs, and console should be one of those tabs. So you can actually write JavaScript or execute JavaScript from the console. So again, if I wanted to alert 1, 2, 3 and enter, you'll see that that will actually execute. And you can get variables from your scripts that are connected. It's really powerful. Now this undefined that you see here just means that nothing was actually returned from this alert function that we wrote here. So we can put expressions in here. We can actually just put in a number. If we say 4, it'll give us back 4. If we say 4 plus 4, it'll give us back 8. We can select things from the DOM. In fact, if I just type the word document, it'll give us the entire document structure, so the HTML tags, all of that. If we want to select something from the DOM, we can do that from here. So we have this H1, and if we wanted to select that, we could use document dot query selector and pass in an H1, and we could do something like dot style dot color equals red, and it turns it red. All right, now I know that a lot of you guys might not know what query selector means, the style and all this, and don't worry about it. I'm just showing you that you can do pretty much anything you could do from a JavaScript file from within your console. Of course, it's not going to stick. If I reload, it goes away, but we can use it for testing, debugging, and just trying things out. All right, now if we want to log to the console from our application, let's put a comment in here. And by the way, if you don't know about JavaScript comments, // for single line comments, and a /* and then an */ for multi-line comments. Okay, and I'll just go ahead and leave that in there. But let's go back up here, and to log to the console, we simply say console.log. All right, and we'll say hello world and save. And notice that it executes right away because I'm using live server. If you guys are not, then you'll just have to reload after you type your code in. All right, so that's how we log to the console. If we hold control and mouse wheel, we can make this bigger or smaller as well. All right, so that's logging a string, and we're going to get into data types and all that later on. But just to show you, we can also log numbers. So we'll log 1, 2, 3. Now notice that the number is blue. That's because at least in the Chrome console, I'm not exactly sure about the others, numbers are blue, strings are going to be black. All right, we can also log booleans, which is a true or false. Go ahead and do that. Booleans are also blue. We can log, we can log variables. If we want to create a variable, like let's say greeting, and I'm going to get into variables too. Sometimes I might do some stuff that I haven't explained yet, but we will get into it in a little bit. So if we want to log greeting and save, you can see it logs hello. All right, we can also log arrays. Okay, so an array, we're going to just put some brackets. We'll just do an array of numbers, save, and you can see it logs the array. It also gives us this little arrow so that we can see each individual index and value. Okay, we can also log objects. So let's put in this is an object literal. So we'll say A1, B2, and save, and that'll log the object. And just like the array, we can hit the arrow button and we can see it in a more readable form. All right, another thing you can do with objects, which is really cool, is you can do console.table. Okay, so let's grab that and save, and it'll actually print the object out as a table. So we have the index and then the value. All right. Another thing we can do is log errors. So if we say console.error, so at some point in your application, you might want to, output something as an error. So we'll say this is some error and save. And notice that it logs it, but it puts it in red. It also shows us exactly where it is in the application. If I click on this link here, it'll bring us to the sources tab and show us the code, which you can't really see. Let me just make this bigger, and it shows you right where it is. Okay. Now, in addition to, all right, let's close that up. Whoops. We just want to go back to our console. All right, so we can also clear the console, which is a good thing to do right about now. So if we say console.clear and run that and save, you'll see console was cleared. Okay, in addition to errors, we can do warnings. So we can say console.warn, and we'll say this is a warning. And it does the same thing as error, except it makes it yellow. And again, you can click on it and you can see exactly in the code where the warning happened. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you is the timer. So if we say console.time and we give it an identifier, like let's say hello, and then down here we're going to say console.timeEnd, same identifier, hello. And then we can do anything in between here. Let's say we would just want to console log hello world a bunch of times. Oops. We'll go like that, and I'll just tab this over and save. So what it did is it ran all this, it console logged hello world, and then it gave us the time that it took from this point, from the beginning to the end. Okay, so if you ever want to know how long something takes in your script, then you can use console.time. All right, so there's a lot of stuff here that you're probably not going to use for a little while, but I wanted to show it to you anyways. What we're going to be using the most is just the console log, just to show the output of whatever it is we're doing at that time, whether we're looping through something, whether we're looking at the result of a conditional, whatever it may be. We're going to be using the console to debug, to show things, and it's going to be a big part of this course. All right, so that's it, guys. In the next video, we're going to start to look at variables, and we're going to look at the different ways to declare variables like var, let, const, and then we're going to move on to data types. So I will see you in the next lecture. Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about variables and declaration. Now, there's three possible keywords to define a variable. So we have var, which has been around since the beginning of JavaScript. We also have let, and we have const, which were introduced in ES 2015, also called ES6, which was an update to the JavaScript language that included many new features. Now, since this is a modern JavaScript course, let and const are now fully supported in the browser. We're going to stay away from var after this video. Okay, let and const have a big advantage when it comes to block level scope, but I'm not going to go over that in this video. We're going to wait till the end of the section because there's no sense in talking about scope and functions and blocks when I haven't even talked about functions and blocks yet. So I'm going to give you some examples of all three and kind of explain the differences between them. And then, like I said, later on in another video, we'll talk about block level scope and how that works. All right, so let's quickly go over how to actually create a variable, which is very simple. For this example, I'm going to use var, but like I said, we'll use const and let after this. All right, so let's go ahead and declare a variable with var. So we'll say var name equals, we're going to set it to a string called John Doe. And I'm going to go over data types in JavaScript in the next video. All right, and strings can be double quotes or single quotes. So that's all there is to actually declaring a variable. So we can do what we want with this. We can go ahead and console log it. So we'll say console log name and save. It runs, and you can see we get John Doe down here in the console. Now we can take this variable and we can reassign it. Okay, we can do that with var and with let. Const is a different story, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But if we wanted to, we could say name equals, and let's say Steve Smith. And then if we were to console.log name here, you'll see we get John Doe for this log, and then we change it, and then we get Steve Smith. So you can reassign variables if you use var or let. Okay. Now you can also assign or create variables and not assign them to a value. So I could say, let's say init a variable. So this is called initializing it. So we'll say var greeting and not set it equal to anything. All right, now this is actually setting it to undefined. So if I were to console.log greeting and save, we're going to get undefined. Okay, but we can take this variable and we can assign it to something now by just saying greeting, and we'll just set it to hello. All right, so if I go ahead and console.log it here, we get hello. Now, a lot of times you'll do this, you'll initialize it without a value if you need to, if you have a conditional. So let's say we have an if statement, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and we want to say if something is true, greeting equals this, if something or else, greeting equals this. So that's one of the reasons we initialize variables. All right, now before we get into let and const, I just want to talk about rules and conventions of variables in JavaScript. Now, there's only a couple different things that a variable can include. It can include letters, numbers, an underscore, and a money sign. Okay, so these are the only characters that can be inside of a variable. They also cannot start with a number. Okay, so if we were to try and create a variable called one name, you'll see that it's already throwing an error inside the editor here. And if I were to save that, we'll get an error in the console saying invalid unexpected token. We'll get a syntax error. Okay, this is not allowed. You can use a money sign at the beginning or anywhere, but that's not really recommended. The only time that I would suggest using this is if you are using jQuery and you were selecting things from the DOM with jQuery, which globally uses a money sign itself. So if you're setting a variable to a jQuery object, then you might want to use that. You could also do an underscore. That's okay. That's not going to throw an error. But again, I wouldn't suggest it. When you start getting into more advanced JavaScript patterns and you can have private variables, that's where you might see this. This is kind of global for private variables. And that goes for like frameworks and stuff like that as well. But usually you just want to start it with a letter. All right. Now let's talk about conventions for more than one word. So multi-word variables. Let's say we want a variable called first name. So what I would suggest is using this method. And this is called camel case. And this doesn't just pertain to JavaScript. This is programming in general. This I think is the most readable. You might also see something like this. You see this more in languages like PHP. Let's set this to Sarah. So this is just under the underscore method or underscore convention. You might also see this. Okay, so this is Pascal case, which is the same as camel case, except it starts with an uppercase as well. All right, and then sometimes you may see multi-words all lowercase, which I wouldn't recommend. This is what I would suggest. This is the convention we're going to use throughout the course. All right, now this here, starting it with an uppercase, this is recommended in some situations. For instance, when we get into object-oriented programming, when you create a constructor function, that should start with an uppercase. When you create a class and with ES6 classes, that should be uppercase. Okay, so there are certain times when this convention is recommended, but just for regular variables, then I would suggest this, and that's what we're going to use. All right, so now that we've talked about the basics of variables, let's now talk about let and const. So let works very similar to var. In fact, it seems identical on the it is identical on the global scope, but you have advantages when it comes to block level scoping, which again we'll talk about later. But if I were to take, let's say, this block of code right here that we wrote and do the same thing with let. So I'm going to paste that in, and then I'm going to comment everything up here out. Now in VS Code we can highlight everything and do Control / and that will comment out everything. So what I'm going to do is just change this to let and save, and you'll see it works the same exact way. We can initialize, we can create a variable, and then we can change it. We can reassign it. We can also initialize it as undefined, so we can go let name just like that, and that will still work as well. Now const works differently, so I'm going to just go ahead and comment that out. So const actually stands for constant, and what that means is that it can't change, okay, or it can't be reassigned. So if I say const name equals John, and we console.log name, that's fine. Okay, we get John, everything's okay. But what we can't do is reassign. Okay, so if I say name equals Sarah and save, we cannot do that. You'll see we get an error. It says assignment to constant variable. So that does not work. So I'm going to comment that out. Another thing we can't do, or we have to do, is we have to assign a value. So we have to assign a value. We can't do const greeting and not assign it to anything. If I save that, we're going to get an error that says missing initializer in const declaration. It has to be declared as some kind of value. Now, where some people get confused that are just starting out is when we use const with arrays and objects and other types of data that aren't primitive, like strings and numbers, things that can change but not be reassigned. So for instance, if I were to say const person, and I know we haven't talked about objects yet, but this is actually really important, so I'm still gonna mention it. So if we were to set name to John here, and we go down and console.log our object, okay, that's called an object literal, you'll see we get, let me just comment this part out, we get our object with name John, okay? And objects can have more than one key value pair, so we could say like age 30, and we can put whatever we want in here. Now where people get confused is that we can take that person variable, that person object, and we can mutate it. We can change the name, for example, and save, and you can see that now name is Sarah. So we can change the stuff that's in here, we just can't reassign person. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Even though we changed the data inside the object, it's still set to that object. All right, and I could change the age if I wanted to by saying person age equals, and we'll say 32, and save, and you can see now age 32. All right, so same thing with arrays. If I were to create an array called numbers and just put some numbers in here, and then go down here and log it, you'll see it'll log the array. Now I can add on to this by saying numbers.push, which is a method we can use to add on to an array. So I'm going to add on 6 and save, and now you can see that array has 6 in it. All right, so we can change arrays and objects that are assigned to variables using const. We just can't redeclare and say numbers equals and then set it to a brand new array with 6 in it like that. If I do that, we're going to get an error because this is a whole new array. Okay, it's a whole new entity. We're not just mutating it like we are here. All right, so that's where some people get confused with const. They think that whatever you assign it to, it has to stay this, but it doesn't if it's an array, an object, or another reference type. Now, this is where you make a decision as a developer on how you want to declare your variables. Now, it's all preference, but what I would recommend and what I do and what I'm going to do in this course is I'm going to use const unless I plan on the value changing, unless I need to initialize it, or unless I'm using it in an iterator or a loop. Other than that, using const lets your program and anyone looking at your code know that this value should not be reassigned. All right, it can mutate if it's an array or an object, but it can't be reassigned as a new primitive value. And I think that that makes your code more robust, more secure, and it makes it more readable. Okay, it lets you know that this value needs to stay this value. All right, so I know that this may have been a little confusing for people that have never worked with arrays and objects, but I did want to just mention that because I think it's important to know. But in the next video, we're going to start to talk about data types in JavaScript, both primitive types and reference types.